Well, hello to my friends and my lovely viewers. Today's book review will be on this book right here, The Incomparableness of God by George Swinnock. Hopefully I pronounced his last name correctly. And here, if I'm honest, didn't think I would read this book all that soon. I think I was looking at, the Puritan paperbacks, what's most helpful for me, what's more practical, right? And my first impression of this book, when I hear the incomparableness of God, well, right away I thought it was going to be a little bit more intellectual, maybe like very, very abstract. But what I found was, it was very good. Just as with all Puritan paperbacks, it was very good. So even though it is a little bit more on the intellectual side, it sort of talks about, the greatness of God. How does that affect, what you believe and how that plays out in your daily life. And what I found was George Swinnock, he really did do a fantastic job of presenting the greatness of God, how incomparable he is, and how that affects what you believe about God and about the world, really. So, if I could give you the basic premise, here it's based off of Psalm 89, verse 6. For who in the heavens can be compared to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty can be likened to the Lord? And really, he just writes the rest of the book off of this. And if I can show you the table of contents here, the first section here, he sets off on that basic premise of, God is incomparable in his being, who he is. And then from there, he draws a little bit more of, how does that play out? God's incomparable in all these traits. And then here, there's more of his workings, his word, and even, sin. Why is sin so awful if God is incomparable? And towards the end, as always, the Puritans are so great with application, right? So how does that affect you? So they labor for acquaintance with the incomparable God. Motives for that, the means, how do you do that? Fervent prayer, exhortations to do this, right? What you do here, go chase after it. More exhortation, if this is how great God is, then give God all the glory, and then some comfort to the end. How does this comfort Christians? How should it comfort you? So if I can give a few points, because what I've realized is my videos, they've gone 30 minutes. I'm not so sure that a 30-minute book review is the most helpful for everyone. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more concise, just pick away at a few main points and talk about why, this book is worth reading, why these points are good. And right away, George Swinnock talks about, the excellency and the image of God. So he uses this analogy of princes. Princes, they stamp their image onto precious metals. So they don't put it onto worthless metals like brass or whatever, but it's on coinage. In the same way, God, what does he put his image on? And we see on human beings. And we see, there's human dignity, there's the value of a human life. And really that's rooted in the image of God. God has stamped his image on each and every person who exists. And the early section of the incomparableness of God, he really talks about how God is independent of all things. God, he's made creation, he sustains creation, but he's not dependent on creation whatsoever. So for us as humans, we're dependent on food, on water, on other people, on one another. We're dependent on God ultimately. But God himself, he's not dependent on anything. And I think that's something that's a little bit hard for us to grasp as dependent creatures. If God did stop sustaining the world, we would all just disappear. But God would still be there. But for us, it's just hard to fathom, right? I know I'm dependent, but what does that truly mean? So that's a mystery to consider. Another good point I found was, God being the creator, he's also the source of every good thing. So there's a quote there, if I could pull it up briefly. So whatsoever good is in the effect is more abundantly in the cause. So God, he is the principle and cause of all good and excellence. So how much better is, the origin of these things in God. So here it talks about, life. We all have life, but God, he is the fountain of life. How about light? We see light, we see how good light is, but the Bible in John 1:9, it calls him the father of lights. To food and bread, Jesus, he is living bread, living water. So just how much better is God even than the earthly things that we see? And I think if you meditate on that, you really come to an understanding that God is truly just so much more glorious than these things. And even in all creation, if we were to see an angel today, I'm sure, as humans would be amazed. In the Bible, we see time and time again, a human being falls over in worship to an angel. The angel says, "Don't worship me. Don't worship me. I'm a created being." And if we already think that angels are worth worshiping, how much greater is God? God is even greater than the most glorious parts of creation. So, we might be able to envision things that are just amazing. We think of human inventions, all sorts of things that have glory, even like maybe athletes, how well they move. But God, he's just so much more glorious than even the best of these things. But yet, no man, no woman has ever seen God. But God shines brighter. And then it goes into some of his traits. So God, there's this idea of divine simplicity. God cannot be separated from all his traits. So, love, holiness, justice, and wrath, they're all, one. It's not just not separate parts. But one of the points that George Swinnock really highlights is God's mercy. And he just really flushed out this point for me because we understand mercy a little bit. We love to throw the word mercy and grace around in church. And Swinnock just gives such a depth of level of understanding to God's mercy. Yes, before I knew God was merciful. But during this section here, God's mercy almost leaves you like just speechless. You understand that, God, he knows every single human being. He knows me. He knows that I am quite the sinner, quite the wicked sinner. If I really reflect on my conversion, why was a sinner like me saved? A sinner who would just sin time and time again. Why in the world would God save me? So God, knowing all that I am, knowing all that humans are, the sinners that we all are, God delights to show mercy. Though he is a just God, though he has to have justice, God delights to show mercy. So he's rich in mercy, he glories in mercy. And I think that chapter alone and just the incomparableness of God is just such a good chapter on, if you need mercy from God, if you wonder, does God actually show mercy? Is he just all wrath? That chapter is just like, wow, like God is so merciful. So I highly recommend that chapter. And there, he made an interesting point too, because when Israel mourns the fact that, God will not go up with them, God says, I'll send an angel with you, but I myself, my presence will not go with you. And other people mourn. They're like, oh no, we're like, what good is it if God doesn't come with us? And I think for a long time, and I think it's still partially true, right? It's no good going somewhere without God's presence. But Swinnock brings up an interesting point in that, if God sent an angel with them, but if God's patience with his people has run dry, God's infinite patience, somehow the Israelites have, just angered God enough where God is like, I cannot go with you anymore. Then how much less patience does an angel have? How much less patience is the angel going to show God's people? Because we read the Bible and they're just rebellious. They're stiff-necked. And they've already pushed God to limits. So who knows? Who knows what would have happened if they went with an angel? The angel might have rightly lost its patience and just slayed them all. I think that is a possibility. Then there's another good point that Swinnock brings up, is that God himself, he does not change. And I think a lot of us can recognize this intellectually, but we sort of wonder, right? God has created an angel, and he loved the angel, but then afterwards the angel, apostates, becomes a fallen angel. Does God change? Does God now hate that angel? Same with human beings, right? If you were a sinner before, you're an enemy of God, but now you become a child of God. God now loves you. Has God changed? And his answer is no, God has not changed. So his analogy is, like the sun. The sun itself hasn't changed, but the change is outside. So if you bring some clay, the clay will harden under the sun's light. But if you bring wax will soften, it will melt. So both of these things, they have different effects, but the sun itself has not changed. So likewise, God himself has not changed. The change is in the things outside. So I thought that was a great point as well. And another great point is God's sovereignty. So God's sovereignty over the water, the waves, the wind, these are things that we consider, almost chaotic. We can think of, the disciples when they sail across the lake, and the winds and the waves are just beating upon the boats, and they're crying out to Jesus, save us, don't you care that we're perishing? And then Jesus, he just, with one word, be still. And the waves and the wind, they all calm. But human beings, what can they do? So there's a story in there, a king, he's upset that the waves are disobeying him. So he commands his soldiers, give it some lashes. Give the waves lashes. But of course, that does nothing. If you've watched Vinland Saga, maybe you've seen that scene where King Canute, he's the king of England and Denmark. And he makes his speech to Thorfinn, I'm the most powerful man in all of England and Denmark. And he looks out to the waves and he says, observe my power. Waves, stop. And of course, well, even though it's an anime, the waves do not stop. So in a similar way, we recognize, just how powerful the wind and the waves are. It's beyond human control. But God, he controls the wind and the waves like a baby in a swaddle cloth. It's just effortless. So Jesus, he commands just with a word and they stop. God, he can command the wind and the waves however he likes, and they'll be at his command. But for us, the wind and the waves are far beyond human control. And perhaps, as you read more of this book, there's a lot more points I could mention about just the greatness and the incomparableness of God. As you see just how much greater God is, then it really shows you, your baseness, how terrible you are as a sinner. The greater God is in his holiness, in his mercy, in everything, the more you see how awful you are, how terrible your sin is, how it offends God. If God is the highest being, then the highest crime truly is sin. This is what God finds the most repulsive of all things. It's not just dirtiness, You can think of the story of Uzziah, who reached out to the cart so that the cart wouldn't touch the mud. It's not just dirtiness, but human sin is the worst offense. It's the thing that offends God the most. And so really, a right view of God, it leads to that view of just self-abhorrence. And really, it should cause concern, right? How should you then live? What's the right way to walk before God? And really, it's to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Well, and of course, before that, it's to be forgiven of your sin. Go to Christ, find mercy in Christ, and be forgiven of your sin, and be in a right relationship with him. And even if you don't do that, well, he quotes Job that, your righteousness, you could be the best that you could be, that's no gain to God. Or even if you decide to be the most wicked sinner in rebellion against God, Your, your wickedness, it will not injure God. It will not cause God any harm. But the fact that God even desires to save human beings, the fact that he does notice us, God is just incomparable, so great, so full of power, yet he stoops down to notice sinners like myself, like you. That in itself is a mystery. And not even just to notice us, but Swinnock uses this phrase of, God marries us to himself. The Christian, if you've been redeemed by the blood of Christ, you're now a child of God, you're part of the church, and one day, you're the bride of Christ. You're going to be married to God for all of eternity. And that is, quite frankly, just shocking, isn't it? That God would take sinners and enemies who've offended him, and yet he would offer himself to them. And Swinnock makes this point that, you can labor for many things in life. You can work hard for, a job, a house. Over here in, Toronto, Ontario, the housing market, awful. It's like minimum at least $1 million for, a tiny house. But, you can labor for all these earthly things. It'll take you effort, time, blood, sweat, a lot of money. Then you can gain them. There's a high cost. But for God, you can gain God at, less than anything earthly. If I were to work for a house, it might take me like a decade before I could buy the house. But to gain God, it's a bit of a dichotomy almost. Like, yes, I sacrifice, I leave behind the entire world. But at the same time, I haven't truly worked for anything, right? God freely offers salvation. I simply take him at his word, I believe his promise, I turn from my sins, and I follow him. And God is mine for all of eternity. And that in itself is just a shock, because all things are going to pass away. This world, possessions, relationships even, they're all going to just pass away. But my relationship to God will never pass away. So that is just amazing. That's a truth. Because, whatever God demands, God provides. What God demands of you in salvation, God has provided that for you in Christ. And what a blessing it is to have God as your God. And I think that's one point that the Puritans make often. My God and my Lord. That the possessive. What a blessing any Christian has to be able to call God my God. That in itself is just such a mystery. Psalm 144:15, happy is the man whose God is the Lord. So, even though that we don't really own anything in this world, nothing is truly ours. But God, he's our great glory. God, he's our great possession and inheritance. God is just incomparable in his wisdom and why he's chosen to do this. So, this book, Incomparableness of God, I think it runs about 188 pages. 194 actually, but highly recommend. George Swinnock, he takes this concept of just God being incomparable from Psalm 89:6, who is like the Lord our God, and he just draws so many wonderful truths from it that just deepen your appreciation for who God is, for his work of salvation. And really, I think that part on God's mercy alone, God delights in showing you mercy. Despite all the wrath you deserve, God shows you mercy. It's just mind-boggling. So if you find that your view of God is just so small, then this book is for you. If you find that you don't see God's mercy as you should, read this book. If you think God's mighty workings and power are just run-of-the-mill, read this book. He just has so many good truths, and he uses so many illustrations that just help you understand it. You understand it just a little bit in human proportion. How much more in God, in God's power? How much greater is God? So that's it for this book. Hopefully I've summarized a few of the good points and whet your appetite for it. And I hope too that you do see God is truly incomparable. He is worthy of all your worship. And really, you cannot offer enough worship. I believe he makes that point as well. All the worship that you could offer is still not enough for God. But God will still accept your worship because of what Christ has done for you. And what a mystery it is. I, as a Christian, get to dwell with God forever, for all of eternity. So, thank you again for watching this video, and I hope it's been of some encouragement, and I hope to see you in the next video. Grace to you and peace.